Eucatastrophe by A Real Sword. Chapter 7. Logan. It's not hard to tell where the banquet's being held, even though nobody actually formally points them in its direction. All the glowing mossy walls are flashing and pointing inward, to the heart of the mountain, and every glowing sprite and many-limbed creature they pass is also heading in that direction. Their small group even gets a few nods of greeting from others heading their way. "Remember," says Logan, adjusting his neat blue overtunic and glancing back at everyone else. "Don't draw his suspicion too quickly." "We know, Lo," says Virgil, who sounds about as grumpy as someone who's been unwillingly forced into the anachronistic 16th century version of a tuxedo ought to be. "Keep it subtle." Patton makes up the third and final part of their group, and he's currently tying the long, velvet-lined jacket he'd found in the back of the closet over his shoulders, because apparently he only knows one way to wear a long-sleeved article of clothing, which is the incorrect way. "Are you sure there's not a better way to do this?" he says, sounding a lot more anxious than the literal embodiment of anxiety actually sounds and looks right now. "I mean, if he's you, then he's bound to be real smart enough to figure out what we're doing." "I'm aware," Logan says. And what he doesn't say is that he's actually more than aware of this, and it's the one thing that could tear this entire, flimsy, poorly thought-up plan of his to metaphorical shreds. He is hoping, quite desperately, that he is not quite as similar to the Earl King as he suspects he is. Down the hallway, sticking as closely together as they can, all signs, fungal and otherwise, point right to the location of their destination. There are no doors, just two tall trees that grow around the frame of an entrance, meeting each other at the peak of the arch, with their branches twisting together like a Celtic knot. Inside, the brightness and movement is staggering in its liveliness. There are colors within that Logan doesn't have names for, and he suspects that he'll never see again outside of these walls. Fae of every sort and size are there, flitting across the grassy expanse that seems to be serving as a dance floor, crowding around the long tables on the sides of the room, congregating around the Earl King at the far end of the hall, who hasn't noticed them yet. Patton takes in an extremely deep breath and offers his arms out to both of them. Logan hesitates before threading an arm delicately through the crook of Patton's elbow. Virgil, on his other side, does the same. They stand still for a moment, the rest of the fairy court flowing around them easily, paying no attention at all. "As I believe a certain prince would say, it's showtime," Logan says, and then frowns. "The appropriate terminology is fracture-aphibia, correct?" "I know you already know it's break a leg," sighs Virgil. "You're doing this on purpose." Logan is. They have, in fact, had this exact conversation at least once before. He doesn't say it out loud, though, because admitting that he's trying to lighten the mood would go against the entire point of doing so. "Fracture-aphibia is pretty good, though," Patton remarks. "More same-word sounds. It's almost like a pun." "It's called alliteration," Logan says, "and yes, it is particularly pleasing." Lose a limb," Virgil suggests. "Fracture your foot?" Patton offers. "Tear a tibial tubercle," Logan says. "No idea what that is. I'm assuming it's obscure leg part," Virgil says. "What are we even talking about?" He shakes his head, grimacing. "Don't we have a horrifying party to go to?" "There's nothing particularly horrifying about it," Logan assesses, squinting, "apart from the bright, optically impossible color scheme, maybe." Virgil laughs, although it's more like a humorless little cough. "Yeah, but all parties are horrifying to me, remember?" They enter the room. It's even more dazzling inside, and Logan momentarily has to shut his eyes in order to entirely process what he's seeing. When he opens them, he's very glad that they're all linked to the arms, because he has a feeling that if they weren't, he'd have lost the other two almost immediately, or fallen over from disorientation. "So what? Do we just mingle?" Patton asked, sounding unsure. "What's the etiquette for fairy parties?" "I hate mingling," Virgil mutters, and presses closer to the two of them, as a tall, shifting figure wreathed in shadows and a faint scent of copper strides past them. Logan doesn't miss the way that the shift in position ends up covering him and Patton from a potential attack from that angle, but he doesn't say anything about it, and neither does Virgil, who just glares in the retreating figure's direction and carries on as if nothing had ever happened. Besides, aren't they all on orders to ignore us or something? Logan surveys the chaos and clamor of the banquet. Fey creatures everywhere. There's an entire bear leaning against one table, apparently listening intently to what the glowing blur of light zipping to and fro in front of it has to say. Really, it doesn't look all that much like a banquet. More like an informal dance, or possibly a midnight revel. True, there's platters of perfectly prepared, luridly colored food covering just about every surface remotely resembling a table, but it's more like a buffet than anything else. Mingling may be difficult with that in mind, he says, but we should make our presence known. Stick together and remember what the twins said. No eating the food? Patton asks, and his gaze shifts away to the tables piled high with decadent dishes of all sorts. But it looks really good, and I'm hungry. No, you're not, says Logan firmly, quashing the faint hint of annoyance that threatens to creep into his words. We don't need to eat morality. Although that isn't quite true, is it? Even as he thinks about it, he becomes aware of the faint gnawing of hunger in the pit of his stomach. Being human has its limitations, and he doesn't like them in the least. Maybe it's just the power of suggestion, Logan thinks, and hopes desperately that really is the case. Remember what happened the last time fairy food got involved? Virgil is saying, and Patton is pulling a face and nodding reluctantly. So, no eating, no drinking, no kissing, no fucking. No dancing, no real names, don't make promises or bets, try not to offend anyone. Is that everything? He adds, glancing over at Logan. Logan nods. That is an accurate summary of the information imparted upon them by their two resident fairy mythology experts. Really, Roman is more knowledgeable than his brother on most counts, but Remus does remember every gruesome detail from the darker, more obscure stories, which are slightly more relevant to their current situation. It all balances out, more or less. Music rises over the sounds of movement and laughter and conversation, bright and lively and seemingly coming from everywhere at once until Logan narrows his eyes and pinpoints the source. To one side, right next to the Earl King, a group of feathered creatures are hard at work providing an accompaniment for the evening's festivities. It sounds almost Celtic in origin, judging by the style and percussive elements. Strings and tambourines, no words. Creatures and beings from all over the room already on their feet, and various other limbs, and whirling across the soft springy grass in wide arcing circles. Swinging from partner to partner, knocking elbows and clasping hands in complex dance patterns that seem to repeat over and over and fold into each other kaleidoscopically. The colors and textures of the air are becoming vague and blurry at the center point of it all. Logan finds himself oddly fascinated by the ritual and takes a step closer to watch, but is tugged back by someone's grip on his right arm. He blinks, suddenly angry, and turns to snap at them, but it's only Patton, looking worried. I don't know if that's such a good idea, he says. How about we go somewhere else for a bit, okay? Reality is thin here, shredding and unraveling at the edges or wherever he pays close attention to. There are dark things beneath the feet of the dancers, and something vitally wrong with the glowing fungus on the walls. He can tell that Patton and Virgil can't see what he sees, and wonders why that is. Wonders if he's really being more needlessly paranoid than anxiety itself. And if not, why is the music being overtaken by a faint but entirely oppressive buzzing in his ears? Logan shakes himself out of it. Yes, he says. That is probably for the best. Patton points to the far end of the room, which looks a little quieter and a lot less impossible to look at, and they start making their way over. It seems as if the Fae in this room either haven't got the metaphorical fairy memo about not interacting with them, or that order's been rescinded temporarily, because quite a few of the ones they brush by attempt to instigate conversation. One of them tries to kiss Virgil with no warning, which Virgil is not happy about, to put it extremely lightly. In the middle of it all, Logan catches snatches of people they know. He hears Dodie's laugh as they hurry past a group of sprites whose wings are alight with burning embers, sees a flash of something that might just be Terrence's grin. A flickering patch of mist bears an uncanny resemblance to Quill. It's impossible to tell if he's just imagining things, if confirmation bias isn't forcing images of friends and acquaintances into his mind. Is it really that likely that so many mirrored versions of Thomas's social circle would be members of a rather sadistic-seeming fairy court? They end up semi-cowering in the corner, avoiding eye contact as much as possible. Logan tries not to look too hard at the inherent wrongness of the colors, or of the alien creatures all around them, or of the food and the drink and the dancers. This was not part of the make their presence known plan, but Logan can't really bring himself to object. At this point, he wants nothing more than to go home, scoop Thomas up as fast as they can, and just leave, no matter how impossible that may be. "I see you found yourself well entrenched in the festivities," says a horribly familiar voice, and the Earl King is standing there, hands tucked behind his back, resplendent in a long coat that appears to be entirely made out of a flowing gradient of maple leaves, perfectly preserved. Logan has to hide a flinch. Virgil makes no effort to disguise the fact that he's bristling with anger and tension. It's probably a good thing that they're all linked at the arms, because at least one of them is ready to fight, and at least one of them is ready to run away as fast as possible right out the door this moment. Damn the consequences. "Good evening, your mash," Patton greets with a little nervous bob that's half a bow and half a curtsy. How's the party treating you so far?" "It is what it is," says the Earl King with a slight incline of his head. "I notice that several of your number aren't here tonight. A terrible shame." The way he phrases it makes it sound that terrible shame is the sort of thing that leads to a quick and violent death. "They'll be along soon," says Logan, and glances around the room, eyes wandering from table to cluster of fairies to table. "Self-preservation was just here, as a matter of fact. He said he'd seen you." "Did he?" The Earl King's gaze follows Logan. "I see. I take it that the other two are preoccupied." "You gave us 6 hours," Virgil snaps. "We've got at least 3 left. You might as well let us use them to free Thomas, since, that's what we came here for." The slightest hint of an angry echo lingers on those last couple of words. For a moment the Earl King's eyes widen, and then he just nods in a fair enough sort of way, face implacable once more. "Come," he tells them, and although the looks on Patton's and Virgil's faces, as well as Logan's own most likely, reflect just how unhappy they are about the very prospect, they do, following him all the way to the middle of the side of the room that's furthest from the doors. There's a long strip of seating there, carved wooden chairs that twist and tangle into each other in a way that most human furniture doesn't typically do, with a long row of short, knee-height table running just in front of it. The Earl King takes a seat at the most central and most ornate of these chairs, and gestures for them to sit. Tentatively, they do, all congregating on the 3 chairs to his left. Logan ends up being the closest to him, and isn't sure if the benefits of keeping the other 2 away from him outweigh what it's doing to his nerves. From here, Logan has an excellent view of the Fey revelers on the ballroom floor, and it's becoming even more apparent that whatever sort of strange dance they're performing, the cracks in reality that they're rending through it are very deliberate indeed. They're dancing to the strange, uneven beat of music in 7/8 time. That's 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3, circle, circle, triangle, over and over again. And on every 7th quaver of every bar, there's a ripping and a tearing, and a glimpse into another place is revealed. Not long enough for Logan to actually see into it, but enough to give him a dreadful headache and to make his skin crawl. And somehow he just can't look away. It's undeniably purposeful, focused. He wonders who's they're dancing for. It certainly isn't the Earl King. He's not even paying attention to them. He hasn't been at all for the entire night. Virgil squeezes Logan's arm a bit too tightly. He snaps out of it, again, and is furious at himself. He tunes back into what's going on immediately around him. Patton's been making nervous small talk with the Earl King all this time, which is the sort of thing that Patton should never have to do, because the Earl King's idea of small talk apparently consists of haughty opinions about the Fae residing in the forest outside the lower town, and their policies on interacting with humans. Patton appears to be nodding along and offering vague platitudes, which is a good tactic that is going to inevitably fall apart extremely quickly and at the worst possible moment. Thankfully, it's about at that moment that a timely intervention arrives, in the form of the only sort of royalty that Logan actually respects. "Earl King, we're here!" A wonderfully familiar voice yells, voice booming and echoing all over the room. The sound of conversation dies down slightly. Ripples of confusion echo across the room before dying down as everyone seems to realize that they don't care all that much, and proceedings return to the Fey equivalent of an equilibrium. But the Earl King looks up after a second, and the remaining color seems to drain from his already immensely pale skin. With a sharp gesture of his hand, the musicians are suddenly cut off, fingers seizing and hands grasping at their feathered throats. This is the cue for everyone else to shut up instantly and follow his gaze, because when the King of Fairies is shocked enough to strangle an entire music troupe on reflex, you tend to want to know what he's so concerned about. Framed in the doorway are 3 people with exactly the same height and build, identical in almost every way except the way they're dressed. all looking slightly ruffled, as if they've run across half the castle to get there in time. Remus is on the left side of the door, bracing himself against one side of the doorway. With the hem of his luxurious, long, and somehow still extremely provocative skirt hitched up in one hand, he beams and waves, panting slightly. "We are late and fabulous." "One Thomas, as promised," Roman declares in that same booming voice, and throws an arm decisively to the man who's standing between them, who coughs awkwardly and then raises a hand in greeting. "Hey," Thomas says brightly but unsurely to a room of silence and unthinkably inhuman beings, all of which are currently staring at him in complete disbelief. What is up, everybody?" There are still flowers in Thomas's hair, and pollen dusted lightly over his cheeks. His long, shimmering mother-of-pearl gown is slightly askew, and he's barefoot in the grass, shifting his weight from foot to foot as he looks nervously across at the Earl King, who is at this very moment staring at him in open disbelief. Logan holds his breath. "How?" the Earl King breathes, gathering himself to his feet. He moves slowly but smoothly, rising from his throne like a wave and descending down into the crowd, which parts before him in silent terror. He stalks through the crowds on the dance floor. "How have you done this?" Roman and Remus, on either side of Thomas, close in around him automatically, but the Earl King pushes them aside ungracefully. "Who undid the witch knots?" snaps the Earl King, grabbing a bemused-looking Thomas's head in his hands and tugging roughly at his hair, which is ruffled and a bit windswept, but apart from that, entirely untangled. "All 7 of them, braided all through his hair. Who was it?" No response from any of them. "Answer me!" the Earl King roars. "How did you know to unravel them backwards? How did you know that would unbind him from that room?" "Well, we have a very smart friend," says Roman. "And the spider silk," he insists, whirling to glare at each of them in turn, "stretched all beneath the bed to keep the vines from letting him go. Who did this?" Thomas wriggles and squirms because his head is still being held onto, and it doesn't look comfortable in the least. "None of them did," he says. "I cut them myself." "Don't lie to me!" the Earl King howls with a nightmarish screech of dissonance, loud and horrible enough to rival anything Virgil could ever produce. "Who wiped the kisses from his eyelids? There is no power in our land that can remove an enchantment placed personally by me." "That would be me," Remus says, a hand going to Thomas's shoulder as he attempts to tug him back from the Earl King's grasp. "Using, our incredible powers and tools we brought over with us from the other world." There's a long, charged moment of electric silence. It feels exactly like the split second before a storm breaks. Then the Earl King abruptly releases Thomas's head and takes a step back. His expression is apocalyptic, but his tone is supernaturally calm when he says, "I insist you stay for dinner." "We don't eat," Virgil blurts, and Thomas shoots him an incredulous look. "Eating is not necessary," growls the Earl King. "Stay." Staying, as it turns out, is an immensely awkward affair. The Earl King wants all of their group to join him up on the strip of seating at the head of the room, and they all do, initially, but there are a lot of Fae that want to get a closer look at Thomas out of curiosity, so much so that when he quietly begs the Earl King to move to a less crowded, obviously public part of the room, he actually agrees, albeit reluctantly. Logan accompanies him, and they end up hovering near the remains of the ensemble. The Fae that had been providing music up until Thomas's arrival look extremely dead, or at the very least they're lying, unmoving, near their instruments, hands to their throats and eyes glazed wide open. This could be the fairy equivalent of a calming, restful nap, for all Logan knows. Nonetheless, they don't look like they're going to be up to providing much entertainment anytime soon. This is a fact that Roman seems to pick up on, as he springs to his feet and declares, "How about a song?" "A song?" the Earl King asks, evidently puzzled. "A song," Remus says, tapping his fingers to his lips thoughtfully. "It's just not a proper party without music," Roman exclaims spiritedly, almost maniacally, as if the slightest drop in energy will lead to him crashing and burning on the spot. "And I notice that your band is currently indisposed, which makes for the lousy atmosphere, if you ask me. What do you say?" The Earl King appears to think this over for a moment, and then he smiles, slow and steady. "Certainly," he says, leaning back in his seat. "I'd appreciate some amusement. Sing for me, Passion." "Just a moment," Roman chirps, and promptly flees halfway across the room right toward Logan. Good thinking, says Thomas as Roman arrives, chewing thoughtfully at his lip. What song were you thinking of singing? I didn't get that far, admits Roman. They probably don't know Disney, do they? Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious would probably be an interesting experience for a bunch of fairies, I'm thinking. Unless, says Remus from right behind him. Unless, Roman rejoins, twisting around to look at him. And it must be one of those strange, inexplicable things of theirs where they get identical ideas at once, because they both seem to be on the same wavelength when Roman says, Oh, no, but a cappella? Really? You need music? Asks Logan, catching on, and shoves what looks quite a lot like a standard skin-covered drum at Thomas. Percussion, he explains, and then he takes a long pole with several thick gut strings running along the edge. And bass, hopefully. He plucks experimentally at the lowest of the strings, and a rich, ringing note sounds out around the room. He nods once to himself, approving, and then at Roman and Remus. There you have it. The metaphorical floor is yours. Remus grabs his brother's arm and mutters something, and Roman nods and mutters something back, and then they separate, and Roman hums a fast-paced little melody at Logan. Sea shanty speed and mood? It's pretty repetitive. Watch out for the rhythm change at the end of the verses. It's a doozy, Remus adds cheerfully. You'll know when we're done. Roman gives a cheerful thumbs up. Don't worry too much about it. There's something about this place. I think it's magic. It makes it really easy to improvise musical numbers. Logan and Thomas exchange glances as Roman and Remus mutter unintelligible twin-speak nonsense at each other for another second or two, and then exchange grudging nods before turning and heading right for the center of the room. At their nod, Logan begins plucking out the melody, clumsily at first, but then with more confidence as he starts to get the hang of it. The notes echo louder than would be reasonably expected from such a skinny, non-resonant instrument. It's rich and dark and warm, something between a double bass and a low-tuned harp, and distinct enough that Logan's sure everyone in this room can hear it clearly. Either the acoustics in this room are really quite impressive, or there's something distinctly magical going on. Beside him, Thomas's face contorts into a kind of panicked grimace, and then he starts drumming out a frenetic gallop of a rhythm to the speed of Logan's playing. It's shaky and uncoordinated at first, but it quickly settles down into recording studio quality evenness. Logan has just enough time to wonder if Roman's claim of the world providing a smooth and immersive musical theater experience has any credibility to it, before Roman starts stomping his foot to the offbeat of the melody, a pleasant counterpoint to Thomas's drumming, and begins to sing. My lover's smile is warm, warm and bright like a glowing fire. The color of his eyes, fair and green, sweet with his desire. He's cradling my face, softest lips, never harsh or tight. He twines his arms around me, and he'll stay through the forever night. Almost the exact instant he's done, Remus jumps in and brings the melody up a minor third, voice dripping with excitement and relish as he belts out the next verse. My lover's smile is sharp, sharp and cruel like the raging tide. His kiss is fierce and hot, hot like the coals, tastes of cyanide. We fall into his bed, fingers stab, carving into me. There's sweetness on my tongue, and now we're falling through eternity. It may not be entirely conscious on their part. Maybe they're just getting over-enthusiastic. But the two of them are trying to push the tempo faster, and Logan finds himself scowling in annoyance and plucking louder and more pointedly to rein them back in. Nobody likes a song that speeds up so fast it's almost impossible to make out individual words. Logan sighs sharply through his nose and watches as Roman picks up the thread of the song. My lover braids my hair, fingers deft, weaves love into it. He's gentle and he's kind, holds me close, he's a perfect fit. We're dancing in the grass, soft and cool, bare feet skimming by. There's sunlight all around us, and the breeze is calling us to fly. And back to Remus once more. My lover whips my flesh, howling rage, moves mechanical. There's blood upon my face, and his lips, vengeful cannibal. We fill each other up, blood and bone, folding into one. We are writhing, changing, growing, and soon the world will fear what we've become. There's something wrong with this music. Fundamentally so. There is only Logan and Thomas and Roman and Remus. Strings and drums and voice, and so those should be the only sounds echoing through this room, as the rest of the Fey court watches them in horribly judging silence. But there's something more building up behind the somewhat basic musical accompaniment, an amount of depth akin to a film soundtrack or a full orchestral score. Logan swears he can hear woodwind and fiddle and a deep rumbling bass, although no instruments or musicians of the sort can be seen all throughout the room. Logan is getting a very bad feeling about this. He catches Thomas's gaze and sees that same trepidation reflected there, but he can't stop. Neither of them can stop. Logan isn't sure if he wants to stop, and isn't sure if it's because of some sort of compulsion or out of a morbid fascination of seeing this through. Roman and Remus have identical mad glints in their eyes as they circle each other, and the sound swells around them. They begin rapidly exchanging snippets of melody, cutting over each other to pick up the beat of another's thoughts with astounding fluidity. My lover's smile is warm, tinged with doubt, drilling into me. The color of his eyes, green and mad, sweet insanity. He's cradling my face, hungry eyes, splits me open wide. He twines his arms around me, and he's driving me to suicide. The fey revelers are creeping back onto the dance floor, and Roman and Remus are in the center of it all. They both seem to be so caught up in the almost violent intensity of the song they're singing that they don't notice when everyone around them starts to dance. The song is in common time, the beat strong and steady and kept in place by Thomas and Logan together. But that doesn't stop the dancers from twirling and clapping in precise, complicated syncopation that sets Logan's teeth on edge, twining their fingers and arms together, lifting and leaping, warping reality on the offbeats. Logan can see beyond the veil, and what he sees terrifies him. But whenever he blinks or looks away, even for a second, he finds he can't remember what he's seen, and that terrifies him even more. My lover's smile is sharp, sharply fond, shining bright and proud. His kiss is fierce and hot, steals my breath, leaves me laughing loud. We fall into his bed, like a dream, chase off all the cold. There's sweetness on my tongue, and now our love is blooming, sweet and gold. Roman and Remus are swinging the beat more and more as their voices rise loud above the music and the clapping and the stomping. They're riffing wildly and sliding smoothly up and down the octaves in siren-like glissando as they drive the song further and further away from a steady tempo and into polyrhythmic patterns that seem just as complicated and hypnotic as the movement of the dancers. The drums and bass line aren't enough. Logan can feel the thin control of the rhythm sliding away from him. His mind races as he frantically tries to think of something to do, and when he settles on the obvious answer, he wants to groan and bury his face in his hands. Instead, he clears his throat and cuts neatly across the twins before they can start on a new verse, spinning one of his own on the spot. Neat and precise and no swung beats in the least. Simple spoken word quavers, monotone and inoffensive, bringing things back to an equilibrium. Or so he hopes. My lover's wit is sharp and fast, and last I've heard of him he'd long departed to a different location, hesitation never. Started in his mind, but I myself am left behind, so I'm bereft. Without his eloquence, intelligence seems hardly worth this. Theft, this damned attachment, I must de-attach myself, no need for sentimental, wishful, temperamental inclinations, maybe. When my heart stops yearning, I'll return, be cold and taciturn, but now I've lost my only lover, I'll never love another. The moment the last word, or even the first, really, leaves his mouth, Logan knows he's made a mistake. He tries to stop himself, he really does, but the next thing he knows, the breathless, rhythmic monologue is spilling from his lips again, and what's more, both Remus and Roman are singing their own verses over the top of it, and what's more, Thomas is starting to mutter something of a melodic ostinato under his breath. Overall, the effect is honestly astounding, but Logan doesn't want to see what happens if it continues for any longer. As his fingers move down the fretboard of his instrument to pluck out a particularly high note, he takes his chance. Brusquely seizing it in both hands, he lets out an unholy yell and wrenches them as hard as he can in opposite directions. The instrument's neck is lithe and delicate, and absolutely not up to the task of withstanding his frustration. It splinters into pieces in his hands, and the music grinds to a stop. A feeling like being abruptly doused with freezing cold water washes over Logan, and he lets out an audible sigh as he realizes he can finally think properly for the first time in several minutes. Panting, he looks up to see that along with the rest of the court, the twins have frozen in place. They're staring at each other in mutual horror, as if they're only just now realizing how out of control things have gotten. "Is this the sort of thing you all usually do when I'm not around?" Thomas mutters, looking pale and unsteady, "because I'm suddenly extremely glad you keep it to your own corner of the mind." Clapping echoes through the suddenly silent room, and everyone looks up to see the Earl King with a wry little smile on his face, on his feet, slowly applauding them. He doesn't say anything, but the dancers seem to take this as a cue to gracefully file their way back into the surrounding crowds. Roman and Remus step to the side as well, and when they're joined by Logan and Thomas, Roman just shakes his head and mutters, "Nope, I have no idea what that was." "I can't believe I have to say this, but please never engage in wild musical numbers in the middle of fairy parties ever again," Thomas hisses back at him. The Earl King beckons them back to the front of the room. Reluctantly they go. Logan has the strangest, creeping feeling of having done something wrong, like a child being called to the principal's office for stealing books. But the Earl King doesn't remark on anything that's just occurred. It's almost as if that literal song and dance had never occurred in the first place. The Earl King slides neatly back into what he had been doing before Thomas's arrival, idle chit-chat, and occasionally scrutinizing his domain with an immeasurably pleased look. The distraction seems to have served his purpose, though, because there's another thing that he doesn't comment on, the fact that 2 of their number are missing. It's all going, not well, exactly, but events have at least reached a steady, uneasy sort of equilibrium. The Earl King is exchanging stilted, tense conversation with some of his subjects, and occasionally looks over at Logan and the others to involve them for a moment or two, although Logan can't begin to fathom why. It's at one of these mildly unpleasant conversational moments where the Earl King turns to Thomas to ask him about something utterly inconsequential, the arrangement of the feast on the table, apparently, when he pauses, evidently noticing something is awry. "Your face," he says slowly, eyes narrowed in suspicion. He reaches out a hand towards Thomas, who jerks back reflexively, eyes widening. "What's that on the side of your face?" "Nothing," Thomas reassures him, bringing his hand up to feel at his left cheek, and then not so subtly cover it up under the pretense of resting his hand on his chin. He lets out a sudden, nervous burst of laughter. "Humans get terrible acne under stress, you know." Logan, from his side of the table, can see exactly what's happening to Thomas's face, and why he's trying to cover it up so desperately. Roman can apparently see it too, judging by his summoned grimace. Remus is apparently just not paying attention to this exchange at all, because his gaze is fixed on the massive double doors at the other end of the room. "Don't lie to me," says the Earl King. His look of suspicion has graduated neatly into one of dawning comprehension. He reaches out and grabs Thomas's hand, tugging it forcibly away from his face. "Oh, fuck," says Thomas, just as glimmering, yellow-tinted scales erupt across the side of his face like popcorn, and one side of his mouth lengthens and curves all the way up to his ear. He grabs the hem of his dress and tries to pull it up to obscure the sudden change, but it's far too late for that. The Earl King's eyes have gone very wide all of a sudden. He takes a sharp breath in and then lets it out, very slowly. "I see. I've been deceived." "That is my job, yes," replies Janice, with a hint of smugness to his words, as well as a healthy amount of fear. "And if you were masquerading as him, then—" The Earl King trails off, gaze drifting over Logan and Remus and Roman, as if he's only just now noting the distinct lack of Virgil and Patton, who have, of course, been missing ever since the twins started their musical number. "Well, like we said," Roman bumps Logan's shoulder with his own, "we have a very smart friend." As if on cue, Thomas, the real Thomas, stumbles through the doors in an Avatar The Last Airbender t-shirt and loose sweatpants, looking extraordinarily out of place and entirely confused in a way that puts Janice's earlier acting efforts to shame. Behind him are Virgil and Patton, both looking grimly satisfied with themselves. Virgil is covered in spiderwebs, and Patton has Janice's canvas bag slung over one shoulder. "I don't know what's going on, but apparently I need to be here at this party?" Thomas asks loudly, the end of the sentence twisting up into audible panic. "Oh boy, there's a lot of fairies here." "Well," says Logan, turning to the Earl King and trying not to look too unbearably smug, "I believe this satisfies all of your conditions. As you can see, here is Thomas. We've found him and woken him, and he is now of open eye and conscious mind, attending your banquet. We would like now to leave." The Earl King looks at Logan, and there's that same uncanny connection there. Like staring at a mirror, but the person you're seeing looks nothing like you, even though their every movement reflects yours perfectly. They are nothing alike. The Earl King does things for no reason, and treats people like objects to be traded and gambled with, and he doesn't love Thomas. How can he be Logan if he doesn't love Thomas? It just doesn't track, doesn't compute, that any version of Logan in any universe could sit there on a flower-encrusted throne like a lavishly dressed wannabe god and play with people's lives and throw parties for no reason and smile and clap as the universe is being torn apart right in front of him by strange, illogical songs and dances and just not care about Thomas in the least. He wonders how it is that they, of all the two people in the universe, are somehow one and the same, and he's sure that the Earl King's currently thinking the same thing as him. "Take him," the Earl King declares, not breaking eye contact with Logan, and is that a grudging hint of respect he sees in those sea-glass eyes? It's hard to tell. "He's yours. I'm not one to break promises, and this is no exception." "Fucking nailed it!" Remus crows triumphantly, raising a hand to Roman for a high-five that isn't returned. "However," says the Earl King, and it's flatly ominous enough to stop even Remus right in his tracks, "this ultimately changes nothing. You may have his body back, but his heart is not his own, and his hours are numbered." What?" goes Thomas, who Logan is only now realizing has missed out on a lot. "Leave." The Earl King turns his back with a swirl of his long autumn leaf cloak. It's very much a final sort of gesture, leaving no option for further conversation. It also doesn't seem like he's going to be taking any sort of revenge out upon them, which is a satisfying conclusion to the transaction as far as Logan's concerned. He stands up, tugging Roman and Janice on either side of him to their feet as he does. Together, they power walk awkwardly down the middle of the dance floor and join the others at the door. "Let's get out of here," Janice says quietly, because pretty much every Fae and Fae being in the room is still staring at either them or the Earl King. It's a deeply unsettling experience. "Yes, please," Thomas agrees, looking relieved. Everyone clusters around Thomas, and they set off down the hallway. "Take it easy, trolls, gnolls, and non-binary souls. Peace out," Roman yells over his shoulder, and soon the door to the banquet hall becomes a distant speck at the end of the corridor, and the noises of song and dance are floating back toward them in a faint, heady buzz of sound. Thomas says, and he sounds a lot more coherent than he's been so far since they've arrived in this reality. "I get the feeling that something really significant just went down, but I don't understand, any of it. Why are you guys dressed up all fancy? And, oh wait, Janice! Your face is back to normal." Janice actually grins, openly and genuinely. Thomas's usual smile looks radiant on his face, which, incidentally, is completely back as it was. The scales shine faintly in the glow of the bioluminescent fungus life nearby. It is. He runs the back of a nail against them. Click, click, click. Probably a result of getting your body back from him. This makes some amount of sense, but Logan can't help but feel that there's something not quite right about that, especially since Virgil's own abilities had kicked in before they even reached the castle, and especially since he still feels dreadfully, uncomfortably human. "Long story short, you got all sleeping beautied by the King of Fairies," Roman explains to Thomas, "and kissing you didn't work, so Logan here," he claps Logan on the shoulders, beaming, "worked out how to trick him into telling us how to wake you up." "I did," Logan says. "Speaking of which, how did you end up breaking the fairy kiss part of that curse? He stated quite categorically that no power in the land could undo it." "Mr. Clean," Virgil tells him with a shrug, passing Janice back his bag. "Surprisingly effective against dirt, germs, and inscrutable weird fairy curses. We should probably stock up on it in the future, just in case." "Oh," says Thomas, and sniffs before wrinkling his nose slightly. "So that's why I smell like antiseptic." Roman frowns. "Why did you even bring that along in the first place?" "Oh, be prepared," Janice says, holding 3 fingers neatly into the air. "Okay, so first of all, Thomas was never a Boy Scout, and you certainly weren't," Virgil begins, and whatever he's going to say next is lost, because the door leading to the outside of the castle looms ahead. Remus lets out a loud cackle of delight and rushes forward to shoulder check it open, and surprisingly that does work. Agonizingly slowly, the great slab of wood creaks outwards, and within seconds they're all rushing down the grassy path to the mountainside gates like they're all starring leading roles in the classic grim story of Cinderella, and the clock has just loudly struck midnight, inciting them to flee with great haste. Which, considering the position of the moon in the unfamiliar star-streaked sky, and the amount of time they've spent in the castle so far, might not be an entirely inaccurate comparison. The gates to the exterior of the mountain are wide open. Think whichever of Roman's fictional heroes are applicable in this current situation, and no sooner have they all crossed the threshold between the castle's outside garden and the rocky path outside than they're swinging shut of their own accord. "Now," says Janice, as the gate slams shut behind them with a final-sounding clang, "have we all learned our lesson about lying being a good thing under the right circumstances? We have? Good. Excellent. I expect another sequel video the moment we get back home. Please pick a better time to flex your lying capabilities," Virgil begs. "Maybe when we're not freezing our asses off on the side of a fantasy mountain." Frozen ass," Remus remarks. "Ass popsicle. Tasty." "Remus," Thomas begins, and then shakes his head, apparently out of words. "No, just no. It's all so perfectly normal that Logan could cry. If he closes his eyes, he can almost imagine that they're all ringing the edge of the living room. Almost. There's the echo and the wind, for one thing, and also he can hear his heartbeat, which he shouldn't be able to do that. He wants to stop thinking about that. He really shouldn't, though, because somebody needs to consider the implications of it and start thinking about what it means that Thomas's heart is wrong, because he sincerely doubts that anyone else is going to be doing that anytime soon. "You guys are definitely going to have to fill me in again, because the last thing I properly remember was the ride up here," Thomas is saying. "But from what I can tell, you guys pretty much saved my life? Or soul or something? So, really, I can't thank you enough. Shit, let me..." He goes cross-eyed for a second, squinting at several flowers that have become partly unraveled from his hair, and starts tugging them properly loose. He hands a hydrangea to Logan. Considering everything that just happened with flowers and all, this is probably a little on the nose, but..." Logan, strangely touched by this despite the impracticality and spontaneity of the gesture, takes the small blossom gently from Thomas. "There's no need to thank us, really," he says, and carefully tucks it behind his ear. "This is all essentially a glorified self-preservation instinct. We are not doing anything that you wouldn't do for yourself." "Must you really phrase it like that?" Janice sighs with a roll of his eyes. "After all the trouble I went through impersonating you, it feels more than a bit dismissive. I mean, we outwitted a fairy king for you, for God's sake. A little gratitude wouldn't..." "You're right," interrupts Thomas, pressing a daisy into Janice's hands, which actually manages to shock him into shutting up. Janice freezes for a split second, then accepts the daisy. "Thomas, as much as I love hearing you say those words, they seem to be a limited commodity coming from you. So do me a favor and take them back instantly so you can save them for a less patently absurd situation." "It might be self-preservation," Virgil adds, standing awkwardly a short distance away, trying to shove his hands into his dress jacket's non-existent pockets. "But, at the moment we're separate enough entities from him, I think our actions might not be dependent on him." He shudders. "I don't want to think about it." So someone else has noticed. Logan supposes that's a good thing. Then again, out of all of them, Virgil's probably the one who has the most obvious direct connection with Thomas's emotional state, so it seems reasonable that the loss of that might be disconcerting. "What now?" Thomas wonders. He's shivering slightly. Janice obviously notes this too, because he digs through his ever-present bag of their collective belongings and produces the red jacket Roman had initially brought along and tosses it in Thomas's direction. "I'm absolutely thrilled to find out what happens to us when you freeze to death, so feel free to start doing that now," he says, and when it looks like Roman's about to protest, he adds, "Suck it up, you have a cool cape now, and it was his to begin with." "Thanks," says Thomas, throwing it on with a relieved little sigh. "And in response to 'what now?'" Logan adds, "getting back to town would be a good start, I suspect." Oh! Patton's eyes go wide, and he hops a few steps further down the mountain, squinting out into the gloomy darkness. "Octavian?" he calls. The rest of the group follows him as they carefully make their way back along the narrow path to where they'd seen Octavian of Cadath last. "We made it out," Patton continues, a bit uncertainly. Actually, are you still here?" There's a grunt and a faint noise like someone accidentally rolling over onto their instrument, then a muffled curse, and a few seconds later a slightly disheveled Octavian emerges into the dim moonlight. His gold-trimmed cape is thrown roughly across his body, as if he's been using it for a makeshift blanket, and he rubs at his eyes for a moment before grinning broadly at all of them. "Well, would you look at that, and in less than 24 hours to boot!" He fumbles for the cittern hanging across his back and manages to half-strum a clumsy, triumphant major chord. Now that Logan's looking for it, it's very easy to see where Octavian of Cadath resembles Roman. The confident fluidity of his movements, the intonations and phrasings. And Octavian is a good person, a kind person. Roman's alternate universe double just took 7 strangers up a dangerous mountain just because they looked like they needed help. What does that say about Roman? And what does that say about him? I take it you found what you were looking for? Octavian asks. In response, Roman spreads his arms wide and sings out clear and bright, "Goodbye to the Fey King, and we will be taking our friend from this prison and leave of this hall. A promise was a promise, he's given us Thomas, and now we're departing, O Thomas and all." Octavian actually bounces upon hearing this, a tiny little hop on the heels of his shiny golden-buckled boots, and exclaims, "Oh, wonderful, 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 absolutely exquisite! Look at all of you, dressed up all pretty and all ready for a daring escape down the mountainside. This will be a tale for the ages. Now," he claps his hands together and spins around in a whirl of gaudy, fringed cape and delight. "Obviously, I can't wait to hear all the delicious, dirty details, but there's really no sense sticking around on this horribly floral mountainside for any longer than we have to. Shall we?" Roman helps Octavian drag the cart out onto the path, and after a brief interlude taken to wake the horses and get them hooked up back to pull them along, everyone piles in. Octavian cracks the reins and they're off, rumbling back down the mountain and back to town. Logan takes up the task of informing a deeply interested but also deeply bemused Thomas, and Octavian, who's listening in with extreme enthusiasm, of the details of the previous few hours. Put into words, it sounds incredibly outlandish, and Logan finds himself struggling to say a few key phrases, such as binding curse and fairy banquet. "Quite the adventure," remarks Octavian, when Logan's done. His fingers twitch like he's already itching to write it all down. It's a very good thing that he manages to restrain himself, considering he's the only one currently driving the cart. "And you have my hearty congratulations for that masterful deception of yours, Mr. Logan and Mr. Janus. However," he frowns, "I will admit that I'm not entirely sure what to think of this whole mirror world business. You're claiming that he and I," he gestures over at Roman, "are the same?" "It's only a theory," says Logan, already mildly regretting voicing it aloud with Octavian present. "A strongly supported theory," adds Roman. "I mean, look at us. We're clearly the most handsome ones here. There's got to be some connection. No offense, Thomas." None taken, I think," says Thomas, who's currently on the other side of the cart, squished firmly between Patton and Roman. All 3 of them are sharing Roman's stolen fairy cape, which is just big enough to be used as a makeshift blanket. "But I don't think the mirror people thing is our biggest problem right now. I just don't get what we're supposed to do next. I mean, everyone keeps talking about my heart and how the one I've got isn't right or whatever, and I think they might be right. Like, I know what just happened is super dangerous, and I probably should be terrified out of my mind right now, and I am, actually, but my heart's completely steady." Roman leans over and presses his ear to Thomas's chest, and then he says, "Hey, yeah," with no small amount of surprise. "You're disconnected from all of us right now. That could have something to do with it," Logan hypothesizes, somewhat wildly. They've all tried syncing out again, and had once again failed at doing so. Although Janus's face seems to be back to normal, as far as scales go, it doesn't appear as if any of them besides Virgil have regained any sort of unusual or non-human abilities. It's a puzzle that Logan doesn't even know how to begin solving. What's the factor that determines how human they are? "You're not afraid, just like you were when Virgil ducked out." "Quack, quack," says Patton, "like clockwork." "What?" asks Octavian of Cadath, who hasn't been exposed to their particular brand of inane stupidity for nearly long enough to understand just how ridiculous things can get with them. "It's not exactly like that, though," Thomas says earnestly. "Without my anxiety, I was acting like a total idiot. I didn't have any idea what was going on or where I was, but I know exactly what's going on right now." "You do?" asks Virgil. "Oh, good. Maybe you can let me know about that." "Well," Thomas amends, "I don't know exactly what's going on, but I'm pretty sure that right now we're heading down the side of this mountain to get to that town and—" He hesitates and then shrugs a bit helplessly. "You know, I really don't know what we're going to do after that." "Well," says Octavian, now frowning slightly, "if you've got a missing heart, I may know someone we can talk to. He has some experience in that area. But I will warn you, it's probably going to end up being a bit of a detour." Logan hesitates only for a split second before saying, "I don't see why not." Logan shrugs, somewhat philosophically. It's not as if we have anywhere else to be, he points out, and I'd really like my heart back to normal, to be perfectly honest. So it's settled then, Roman declares. We'll go to see Octavian's mysterious friend, get Thomas back to his normal, hearty self, and head home. Nothing can possibly go wrong with a plan as solid as that. Roman, says Janice, very seriously, please believe me when I tell you this, because I'm not lying in the least. I will punch you. Do not tempt fate any more than it needs to be tempted. And after a few minutes, the darkness swallows them up.